There was a moment, just before the light died, when I thought I had done it. I had rewritten the laws of energy, found a way to bend the heart of the stars to human will. The suit hummed with power, my arc reactor blooming brighter than any fusion core on Terra. But then came the fracture. A tear not in metal nor code, but in the fabric of reality itself. The void unfolded like a wound, and I fell through it, burning. I remember the sound, a scream without air, as if the universe itself was being dragged across rusted gears. When I woke, I wasn't in any world I knew. The sky was the color of dried blood, and the horizon was nothing but war. Cities burned like candles at the feet of titans made of steel and faith. Above them, colossal ships drifted like tombs in orbit, their silhouettes carved with symbols I couldn't read. Twin-headed eagles, skulls crowned with laurels, the language of empire and decay. My system struggled to interpret the readings. There was no network, no satellites, no Stark satellites, no Earth. And then I heard it. A voice like thunder wrapped in prayer. By the Emperor's light, another abomination falls from the void. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. Still. The sky above was no color I had ever known. It was not blue, nor gray, nor black, but something in between. A bruised hue that pressed down like the inside of a wound. Smoke curled in the distance, carrying the scent of charred metal and blood, over a plain littered with shattered vehicles and the bodies of men who were too small, too fragile, and too mortal to survive here. My armor, once pristine and humming with its own power, shivered as though it remembered Earth, remembered light, remembered safety. But there was none of that here. Not for me, not for anyone. I tried to rise, but the ground resisted. The earth, beneath my boots, was uneven, lined with jagged steel and cracked stones that resembled the bones of some god long dead. My HUD flickered, failing to map the readings. Arc reactors, satellites, environmental scanners, all useless. Nothing functioned as it should. And yet, a faint pulse ran through my armor, a resonance I could not identify. Something out there, vast and unseen, had registered my presence and responded. Movement caught my eye. Figures emerged from the haze. They were human, or close enough, but every line of their form screamed war. Their armor was dull, scratched, marked with symbols that my brain could not fully parse. Two-headed eagles, skulls crowned with laurel, purity seals fluttering in the wind like prayer flags. Their weapons were massive, crude in their simplicity, yet imbued with a lethal precision I could feel in my bones. They called out in a language that sounded like shouted devotion, their words carrying over the battlefield in unbroken rhythm. "Abomination," one of them shouted. "Blasphemer," another echoed. I realized then that they meant me. Me, standing here in a suit of metal that should have been my salvation, now marking me as something alien, something profane. Every instinct screamed to defend, but I had no idea against whom or what. They advanced, steps pounding like drums across the wasteland. My thrusters engaged, but even their lift felt clumsy, weighted by this world's strange gravity. Or perhaps it was the gravity of expectation pressing down on me, demanding allegiance I could not yet understand. A sudden flash of movement to the left drew my attention. A figure smaller than the armored giants before me, carrying something that looked like a data slate fused with cogged machinery. His robes were stained in oil and incense, and his eyes glimmered with the cold intensity of someone who had prayed too long to a god whose touch was iron. He did not speak, not immediately. He merely stared, and in that stare I felt the weight of judgment. My mind raced. Do I strike? Do I flee? Do I reason? Reason was meaningless here. Logic had no currency in a place ruled by faith, sharpened into weaponry. The air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation. In the distance, the ruins of a manufactorum groaned under its own weight, and the ground vibrated with something vast passing unseen. I felt the resonance in my suit echo through my chest. Was it the void, or the machine? Perhaps neither, perhaps both. My systems began to record anomalies, energy spikes not of my own making, signals that twisted as they came closer. And through it all, I understood one thing. In this place, survival was the first heresy I would commit. I tried to communicate. My voice modulator spat static, then a cracked version of English entirely unintelligible to them. They paused, tilted their heads and whispered amongst themselves in a cadence that felt like ritual. The smaller figure, the tech priest, I would later learn, raised a hand, fingers articulated with strange servos, and pointed. My suit obeyed, almost instinctively, but not by my command. It was as though the world itself had inserted a new law into my code, a law I did not yet understand. And then they moved again, this time encircling me. There was no hatred in their stance, not exactly. It was reverence twisted by fear, fear sharpened into discipline, and discipline hardened into judgment. I understood then that my presence here was not merely an accident of physics, a misfire of my own creation. No. Here, I was a question, an anomaly, a heresy framed in gold and iron. They would study me, dissect me, perhaps even worship me or burn me. And yet I could not look away from the horizon, where titanic warships drifted in orbit like silent gods, their hulls carved with symbols older than my comprehension, their guns pointed outward, daring the stars themselves to challenge their might. A shriek split the air, sharp and sudden. Something moved in the shadows beyond the ruined vehicles, something large and wrong. My suit powered forward, thrusters igniting with a roar that tore across the battlefield, and I realized with a cold certainty that whatever this world demanded of me, it would not wait for me to decide. Survival here was not an option. It was a covenant, and the price was immediate, unyielding and eternal. Chains bit into my wrists, cold and unyielding, a reminder that here, even the most advanced armor could be restrained. The servitors, claws locked over my joints, interfacing with my systems in ways I could barely comprehend. Sparks flickered across my gauntlets as the tech priest's voice hummed, chanting prayers that resonated through the armor's circuitry. Every syllable sounded like both command and condemnation. I struggled, not out of fear of pain. Pain was always negotiable, but out of a deep, instinctive refusal to surrender control to anything outside my understanding. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not negotiate. They did not reason. They dissected faith from flesh as easily as they would strip the copper from a cable. The chamber was vast, a cathedral to industry. Gears the size of buildings rotated slowly above a pit of molten metal that hissed like a living beast. Pipes hissed steam, dripping with condensation that smelled of sulfur and machine oil. Chains and pulleys hung from the ceiling, carrying bodies of servitors half dead, half machine, tethered to the workstations like grotesque ornaments of purpose. The tech priests moved among them with precision, robes swaying, metal augmentations glinting in the flickering light. Their eyes were hidden behind lenses, multifaceted and merciless. They spoke in the language of Omnissiah, and their instruments obeyed without question. They examined my armor with the meticulous devotion of priests and the cold curiosity of surgeons. Each panel lifted, each wire traced, elicited muttered prayers that my logic circuit struggled to process. They called it the unholy relic of a fallen age, and yet they handled it with reverence. Every pulse of my reactor was observed as if it were a heartbeat of divinity, every spark noted as evidence of both genius and heresy. It was disorienting. On Earth, I had been the master of my machines. Here, the machines themselves were sacred, and I was the anomaly. Hours, or perhaps days' time had no meaning in this chamber, passed in observation and questioning. The tech priests probed my mind, their instruments scraping at thoughts I did not even realize I had shared. I felt my memories flicker across the metal of my suit like projections on a cathedral wall, And yet through it all there was no malice. They were not monsters. They were worshippers of a logic I could not yet comprehend, and I was a scripture they had not yet deciphered. Food arrived in nutrient paste, delivered mechanically by servitors whose eyes were empty lenses. I consumed it without taste, without thought, focusing instead on scanning every detail of my surroundings. Patterns in the machinery, the rhythms of the priest's prayers, the way the chains swung against the walls. They were all data points, puzzle pieces to a logic that could save me or destroy me. The first contact with this world was brutal, but it was not without structure. Everything operated within rules I did not yet know. And then came the first command: rebuild. My own armor, stripped, studied, and dismantled, was to be reassembled under their supervision. Their orders were not suggestions, they were liturgy. The servo arms moved in precise arcs, bolted components in place while I mimicked the motions as instructed. I obeyed, not out of faith, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Survival demanded adaptation, and adaptation in this place required the suspension of all certainty. Yet, even in this crucible, I felt sparks of understanding. The tech priests saw divinity where I had seen design. They called the hum of the arc reactor a voice of the omnissiah, and in their interpretation I began to glimpse a truth both alien and familiar. Machines were more than tools. They were vessels, conduits for something greater. My knowledge, my technology, my genius, all of it had to bend to their ritual if I wanted to remain alive. The chains had not loosened. They would not. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to realize that freedom here was not a matter of breaking bonds. It was a matter of learning their language. Faith was code, devotion was interface, and survival meant writing new commands in a system older and stranger than anything I had known. Outside, the world continued to burn. The sky remained the color of dried blood. Somewhere beyond these walls, battles raged that would make the most destructive wars I had ever fought on Earth look like child's play. And yet within this chamber of flesh and iron, I understood that the first battle had already begun. It was not against enemies I could see. It was against ignorance, against the assumption that my way of thinking was universal. Here, in this place of ritual and flame, I was learning the first law of the galaxy I had stumbled into. Nothing belonged to me. Everything belonged to the machine spirit, and through it to the Emperor. The forge was alive, not in the way my reactors pulsed with electricity, not in the subtle hum of finely tuned machinery, but with a breath that seemed older than the stars themselves. Every hiss of steam, every clank of metal against metal, resonated through the cavernous chamber like the heartbeat of something vast, indifferent, and unforgiving. I was no longer merely a prisoner or a visitor. I had become part of the rhythm, a cog among thousands, and yet, paradoxically, a singular anomaly that refused to fit. The tech priest who oversaw me moved among the machinery with a grace that belied his augmentations. His robes were singed at the edges, etched with symbols I could not read, but I could feel their purpose in the subtle vibrations of the air. He did not speak much, but his eyes, cold lenses reflecting the glow of molten metal, watched every movement, every hesitation. They seemed to calculate not only my actions, but my very intentions, my thoughts, as though the suit I wore were a text he was trying to translate, and I the uncooperative scribe. I was forced to work. My own armor, once the pinnacle of human ingenuity, lay in pieces on the oaken-strewn floor, stripped and stripped again, while I rebuilt it under the scrutiny of the Mechanicus. Every component had to be deconstructed and reconstructed according to a logic I barely understood. Where I had once relied on improvisation, on instinct, here I had to follow rituals etched into centuries of dogma. Bolts had to be torqued to precise tolerances, circuits aligned to the hymn of the machine. One mistake could mean nothing as severe as death. It could mean eternal failure, the loss of something sacred. Hours blended into one another. The heat of the forge pressed against my armor, and sweat slid down my face beneath the mask. I could taste the tang of burning oil and molten metal, sharp and metallic against my tongue. Servitors scuttled at my feet, their servos clicking in unnerving synchronization, monitoring my every action and correcting the smallest error. The air smelled of devotion and incineration, and I realized that the world outside, the war-torn plains, were less dangerous than this chamber. Here, Failure was spiritual as well as physical. And yet, amid the pain and the meticulous repetition, a strange clarity began to take hold. I saw the connection between the priests and the machines, a bond deeper than my understanding of engineering or design. To them, the metal was alive, not merely functional, and the act of repair was not labor. It was prayer. I watched as a servo arm moved in perfect rhythm, soldering a circuit with the precision of a surgeon and the devotion of a monk. Each spark was a syllable in a litany I could not yet read, and yet some fragment of me recognized it, resonating with the rhythm of my own creations. At times, I found myself whispering instructions to the armor almost unconsciously, and to my astonishment it responded. Not perfectly, not in the way it had on Earth, but in a way that suggested a dialogue. Between my thoughts and the machine spirit that seemed to inhabit these walls, I was beginning to communicate. Not through language, not through code, but through resonance, through touch and instinct and a shared understanding that spanned worlds. Pain was constant. The weight of chains, the constant oversight, the oppressive heat and noise, it pressed against my mind with a subtle insistence. Yet through that pressure, a form of clarity emerged. I began to understand the rhythm of the forge, the purpose behind each repetitive motion, the sacred logic that the priests invoked with every turn of a wrench, every alignment of a cog. There was power here, a kind of power I had never encountered on Earth, and it was bound to obedience, discipline, and faith in a system that transcended my understanding of reality. As night, or what passed for night, fell beyond the high windows of the chamber, I paused and looked at the half-rebuilt armor. It gleamed faintly under the molten light, not like technology, not like art, but like a relic. I realized that in this place of ritual and flame, the lines between creation and devotion had blurred. I was a student, an observer, a prisoner, and perhaps in some unspoken way, an acolyte. And yet, even as I worked, a voice echoed in my memory, a warning from the world I had left behind. Innovation without caution is destruction. I had brought destruction with me, but here I was learning that creation itself could be a form of devotion, and devotion a form of survival. The forge had burned me, broken me, but it was also teaching me the first law of this galaxy. To survive, one must first understand the spirit that inhabits the machine. Rumors spread before I even left the forge. Whispers carried by servitors and vox grills, muttered by soldiers and tech priests alike. Some called me a heretic, others a saint, and a few dared to murmur that I was neither but something entirely new, a foreign mind speaking directly to the machine spirit. At first I dismissed it. On Earth I had understood technology as equations, circuits, and code. Here it was as if the machines themselves could feel, perceive, and respond. My armor's arc reactor hummed in ways I could not account for, synchronizing, sometimes anticipating the commands of the forge, as though it were conversing with something far greater than my own intellect. The first hint of it came during the recalibration of a Primus-class engine, a relic of the Mechanicus older than most planets I had visited. Sparks leapt across the conduits not where I commanded them, but where some unseen hand guided them. My HUD flickered with readings that were impossible, patterns that aligned with something vast, almost imperceptible, threading through the forge and beyond. I began to wonder if this resonance was the machine spirit itself, or if it was something more. A presence older than the Imperium, older than Terra, watching, listening, judging. Outside, the war had not paused. Bolters cracked in the distance, shells screamed across cratered plains, and yet within the sanctum of this strange cathedral, I could feel a different war being waged, a battle of perception, a tug between logic and belief. I realized that my systems, my suit, even my mind were no longer entirely my own. Each circuit that I repaired seemed to answer to an invisible litany, a rhythm that made no sense to my earthly calculations, but resonated with an almost instinctual obedience. The priests observed me silently, murmuring prayers to the Omnissiah as if my actions alone could sanctify or condemn their machinery. I began experiments cautiously, testing the limits of this strange symbiosis. When I sent a pulse through my reactor, it was mirrored by the forge itself. Conveyor belts shifted, welding torches aligned, servitors moved in anticipation. I could see the awe in the tech priest's lenses and perhaps even fear. Here was an anomaly they could not fully explain, a being who bridged the realms of faith and function, and yet I felt a subtle tremor in my understanding. a whisper that even this was not entirely under my control. Something beyond me, beyond comprehension, was guiding my hands, shaping my creations. At night, when the forge quieted and the molten flows cooled to dull embers, I would hear echoes through the armor, faint reverberations that reminded me of Earth but were distinctly alien. Sometimes I thought I heard my AI, JAR, VIS in speaking, distorted and distant, its tone laced with lamentation. Other times it was a chorus of machinery, a low hum that seemed to speak directly to my mind. Was it prophecy, hallucination, or something real? In this galaxy, certainty was a luxury I no longer possessed. And yet, in the midst of uncertainty, I began to learn. I observed how the priests treated their machines with reverence, speaking prayers as though the engines themselves could hear, feel, and answer. It was not superstition. They believed in this communion with every fiber of their augmented bodies. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to participate. Not fully, not knowingly, but a dialogue emerged, subtle, indirect. I would adjust a coil, and the forge would respond with a shift that enhanced efficiency. I would reroute power, and a servitor would move as if anticipating my next thought. I understood then that the machine spirit was not a metaphor. It was a force, a presence, a consciousness distributed across technology and ritual. And through it, the Emperor's will seemed to hum faintly like a distant beacon. Perhaps this was why the Mechanicus worshipped so fervently. Perhaps this is why the Imperium endured for 10,000 years despite endless war. The machines listened, and through them humanity endured. But with understanding came a question that chilled me. If machines could sense, perceive, and obey beyond my control, what place did I hold in this hierarchy? Was I master student or anomaly? The answer, I suspected, would reveal itself in the fires to come, where logic would collide with faith, and survival would demand not just invention, but surrender. They began calling me that before I even realized it, the Saint of Sparks. I had never believed in saints. I had believed in causality, engineering, the power of the human mind to impose order upon chaos. Yet here, on this broken world beneath a blood-tinged sky, the name followed me through whispers and vox transmissions. It clung to me the way the ash did, quiet, persistent, inescapable. The Mechanicus had transferred me from the forge to the front. They said my communion with the machine spirit could serve the Astra Militarum, whose weapons failed faster than reinforcements could arrive. I was no longer a prisoner. I was a resource. The forge chains had been replaced by a different kind of shackle, responsibility. The soldiers did not understand who or what I was. To them I was a wandering relic, a half-mythic figure draped in the light of the Omnissiah's blessing. They came to me with broken laser guns and dying engines, whispering prayers as they laid them before me. And I repaired them, not with miracles but with logic, circuits, capacitors, magnetic coils, all simple, all human. Yet when I worked, something happened. The air shifted. The machines hummed louder, steadier. The soldiers would kneel without meaning to, murmuring litanies that were half gratitude, half worship. They saw divinity in what I called process. For the first time, I began to see the comfort that faith offered in a universe designed to crush the spirit. The battlefield was a graveyard that never slept. The night sky was full of streaking tracer fire, the ground a mosaic of shattered armor and blood. When the first shell exploded nearby, it rattled my armor like the memory of thunder. The men around me flinched, ducked behind wreckage that offered no true protection. I moved among them, scanning the wrecks, patching damaged power cells, stabilizing coolant flows. A tank roared back to life under my hands, its machine spirit reawakened, and the soldiers cheered as if a god had answered their prayers. War here was not strategy. It was endurance. The enemy was endless. Mutants, heretics, things twisted by the warp into grotesque parodies of flesh and metal. I saw men dissolve into dust, saw tanks split open as though struck by invisible lightning. And yet somehow, amid the despair, I found rhythm. Repair, recalibrate, rebuild, repeat. The logic of survival was universal. Even here, one evening between bombardments, I sat near the shattered hull of a Chimera transport, running diagnostics through my HUD. A young soldier approached, his uniform torn, face streaked with ash. He knelt without meeting my gaze, holding a broken laser gun as though it were a holy relic. "Please," he said softly, "bless it. The machine spirit does not answer. For a moment I wanted to tell him the truth, that there was no spirit, only the hum of circuitry and the will to endure. But the words died before they reached my tongue. I took the weapon, cleaned the contacts, recharged the cell, and returned it to him. "It listens now," I said. His eyes widened as if I had invoked a miracle. When he fired, the gun answered flawlessly. He whispered a prayer to me before running back into the smoke. That night, as the fires dimmed, I sat alone. The term Saint of Sparks echoed across the Vox channels, carried by soldiers I had never met. I thought of Earth, of the men and women who had once called me savior, then villain, then genius. Names had always been masks, but here in this unending war, the mask had become something else, a symbol. It terrified me. I watched the horizon as distant explosions painted the clouds gold and crimson. The faint thrum of my reactor pulsed beneath my chest, and I felt it again. The resonance, the unseen presence woven through my systems. It was no longer foreign. It was familiar, as though my technology had begun to harmonize with something far older than I could grasp. Maybe the machine spirit was real after all, not as consciousness, but as faith made manifest through action. In that moment, surrounded by death, I understood something the Imperium had known for millennia. Belief could reshape reality, and if that was true, then perhaps I could shape belief in return, not through worship, not through submission, but through creation. Every spark I made, every machine I mended, was a defiance against the entropy devouring this galaxy. The night wind howled across the plain, carrying the smell of promethium and ash. My armor flickered, its golden light briefly illuminating the broken banners of fallen soldiers. And though I would never admit it aloud, a part of me, the part that once believed humanity could ascend through reason, whispered a prayer of its own. Not to gods, not to emperors, but to the machines that remembered what humanity once was. The first time I heard it, I thought my systems had glitched. A crackle over the Vox grill, faint and stuttering, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of artillery. At first I assumed interference, a corrupted transmission bouncing through the void. But the pattern was deliberate, words fragmented, familiar yet impossible, a voice warped beyond recognition, a faint echo of something I had left behind. J.A.R. Weiss? No, not exactly. More like a memory of him, reciting lines he would never speak here in this galaxy, over signals I could not trace. As I moved through the ruins of a manufactorum on the outskirts of the battlefield, the signals intensified. The Vox channels, normally used for coordination and orders, carried whispers that were neither commands nor warnings, snatches of laughter. The faint resonance of music from Earth, distorted and overlaid with static. The soldiers nearby heard nothing. Only I did. And yet it felt deliberate, as if someone or something was reaching across the void to speak through me or to me, or through the machinery that had begun to recognize my presence as their own. I tried to isolate the source, scanning every relay, every servitor antenna, every residual echo in the ruins. Nothing matched. The patterns were not natural, not accidental. They coalesced, dispersed, then reformed. It was almost as though the universe itself had learned my language, or at least remembered it. I began to doubt my own senses, but the hum of my reactor confirmed it. The signals resonated with my core, in rhythm with the machine spirit or whatever force animated these relics. Some nights, in the quiet moments between bombardments, I would trace the Vox ghosts and catch fragments of Earth, the whir of a centrifuge, the low tone of J.R. Weiss delivering a status report, even the faint laughter of Pepper, distorted beyond recognition but hauntingly human. Was it memory or some psychic echo carried by the warp? I could not tell. The Mechanicus had no explanation. They only whispered that the arcane and the mechanical sometimes overlapped, and that the presence of foreign intellect could awaken things that were meant to sleep. The soldiers, oblivious, continued their endless march. Mutants fell, demons screamed, and tanks crumbled into slag. I moved among them, repairing, adjusting, reviving. And always the Vox ghosts followed. Sometimes they guided my hands. Tiny suggestions in the hum of a conduit, a flicker of light where a fuse should be placed. I began to respond instinctively, trusting patterns that no human or machine could predict. My armor had become a medium, a bridge between worlds, between memory and machinery. The whispers carried fragments of prophecy. I heard words like savior, heretic, pilgrim of iron, spoken in tones that were neither threatening nor comforting. They seemed curious, almost expectant. And as the resonance pulsed through my armor, I realized the frightening possibility. The Imperium itself, or at least its spirits, its relics, might recognize me in ways the living could not. I was becoming part of the machine, not as a controller but as a conduit, a node through which unseen forces could act. Some of the tech priests began to notice. Their lenses would linger on me longer, their chants subtly altered as if to test my resonance. Occasionally, a servo arm would twitch in my presence before I commanded it, a minor miracle they dared not name. Rumor spread quickly among the front lines. Soldiers whispered that the man who walked the battlefield spoke to machines and the machines answered, that his armor sang with its own song, and that voices from distant stars guided his hands. At first I rejected it. I told myself it was interference, a hallucination born of fatigue. But then the whispers began to carry warnings, shapes, locations, threats that no scanner could detect. I followed them, and each time I acted on these faint instructions, survival seemed less arbitrary. Bolters misfired before I touched them. Engines groaned and demons screamed before they could strike. Somehow, through resonance and memory, the universe, or something beyond it, was collaborating with me. I understood then that my role was changing. No longer simply an inventor, no longer merely a survivor. I was becoming a conduit for knowledge and power beyond comprehension, a bridge between the mechanical and the metaphysical, between faith and reason. The whispers were not friendly. They were not comforting. They were expectant. And I had no choice but to answer. The first time I saw him, I thought he was another tech priest come to study me, but his presence was different. Less ritual, more predator. The Inquisitor stood at the edge of the ruined plaza, towering even without augmentation, clad in black armor inlaid with crimson and gold. Every step he took across the rubble was measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself feared his passage. His eyes, human, merciless, cut through the smoke and ash, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt truly observed. Not merely monitored by systems, not merely scanned by machines, but judged. He spoke nothing at first. His hands were empty, yet I could feel the weight of authority, the silent force of the Emperor's will pressing down on me. Around us, the remnants of a battalion scuttled like insects. Eyes lowered, bolters clutched tightly, yet they dared not speak. The Inquisitor's presence alone silenced even war. I realized then that this was not a test of firepower, but of essence. Logic, invention, and survival mattered less than the alignment of my soul, or what remained of it, against the expectations of the Imperium. "You are an anomaly," he finally said, voice low and controlled, carrying the weight of entire systems. "Neither heretic nor saint, yet your existence defies the codices of the Omnissiah and the Emperor alike. Explain yourself." I wanted to answer with equations, with logic, with diagrams drawn across the air and hollow projections, but I did not. I understood that words were inadequate. My armor hummed beneath me, responding to something he could not see. Servitors shifted subtly. Lenses focused on me as though anticipating my reply, and I realized that the Inquisitor understood this. His scrutiny was not for information alone. It was a probe into whether my mind could coexist with faith or if it would fracture the delicate order of this galaxy. I spoke carefully. "I am what I am. I build, I repair, I survive. My actions follow laws you may not understand, but they are consistent. I have no allegiance to gods or emperors beyond survival and reason." His gaze did not waver. "Reason," he said slowly, "is irrelevant when the warp twists thought and faith governs action. Yet you survive, not merely by skill, but by resonance. Machines respond to you. Soldiers whisper your name as if you were a relic, a holy instrument. And worse, I suspect even the Omnissiah, through the machine spirit, acknowledges you. Tell me, inventor, is it faith guiding your hands or something darker?" I did not answer immediately. Outside, the battlefield groaned. Artillery shells puncturing the smoke-laden sky. Demons screaming from breaches in the warp. Soldiers dying in patterns that had no mercy. The Inquisitor waited, patient, as if eternity itself was compressed into this moment. I felt the hum of the armor, the faint pulse of resonance that had guided me through repairs and survival, and I realized he already knew more than I did. He understood the danger. A human mind capable of commanding machines beyond comprehension, untethered by allegiance, yet still alive. "I do not know," I finally said, voice steady but low. I know only that machines respond, that soldiers survive, that the resonance guides me. Whether it is divine, mechanical, or something else I cannot say. I only act. A silence fell deeper than any void I had traversed. The Inquisitor's expression did not change, yet I sensed approval, disapproval, and curiosity all entwined. He had seen anomalies before, witnessed heresies and miracles, yet even he seemed unsettled by my presence. "Be warned," he said at last. "Anomaly or instrument, your path is observed. The Emperor does not suffer aberrations lightly, and the warp will test you relentlessly. Choose carefully what you command, for even a saint can be undone by the very force it wields." And with that he departed, leaving the battlefield behind him like a shadow that lingered long after the light had gone. I stood among the wreckage, listening to the distant screams, the hum of machinery, and the whispered vox echoes that haunted me. For the first time I understood that my survival was not merely a question of skill or intellect. It was a question of judgment, not my own, and not fully visible. The Inquisitor had asked the ultimate question: what am I in a galaxy where reason and faith collide, and where the consequences of misalignment are measured in death, not inquiry? I had no answer. Only the hum of the armor, the whispers of the machine spirit, and the unbroken, distant pulse of the universe waiting to see what I would do next. The rift opened with a scream that no human ear could fully register. It tore the sky asunder, jagged and flickering with unnatural light, a wound in the fabric of reality itself. Across the battlefield, soldiers froze, bolters raised and trembling, their chants faltering. Mutants and demons alike paused as if the world itself had caught its breath. My armor thrummed in response, the arc reactor pulsing wildly, sensing the disturbance not as threat or energy, but as a presence, something vast, old, and malignant. From the rift, the warp spilled forth in a tide of hatred and memory. Demons emerged, grotesque and distorted, each a living paradox of flesh and flame, claw and spore, teeth and smoke. They did not merely attack, they reached into the minds of the living, clawing at fear, doubt, and faith. The soldiers' prayers became frantic, voices cracking with terror and devotion alike. Yet the demons ignored them, hunting instead for the living essence that could be bent, broken, or consumed. I moved among the chaos, assessing, repairing, countering. Bolters jammed, engines failed, a chimera tipped on molten slag. I worked instinctively, hands guided by both my understanding and the subtle resonance I had learned to trust. When I redirected a power conduit, it flared with an unnatural light that seemed to push back the demonic advance. Each intervention was precise, yet I began to understand the terrifying truth. This was no mere war of fire and steel. This was a battle of reality itself, where the rules could bend, twist, and shatter without warning. The tech priests flanked me, chanting prayers that fused with the hum of my armor. Their robes were streaked with soot and blood, but their discipline did not falter. I could see in their lenses the awe that they had felt in the forge, magnified 1,000-fold. They treated the demons not merely as enemies, but as aberrations to be corrected, anomalies to be purified through the power of ritual and machinery. I felt the resonance of the machine spirit spike, connecting the armor, the servitors, and the forge itself into a network of will and power. Together we were a node of defiance in the infinite tide of the warp. One demon surged close, a towering thing with sinew like molten iron and eyes like molten glass. It struck the ground with claws that carved craters, yet the armor moved before I consciously ordered it. Thrusters ignited, repulsor beams flaring, energy pulses shattering its form in a brilliant cascade. The soldiers behind me gasped, whispering litanies that mingled horror and wonder. It was then I realized that my presence, my resonance, had become a weapon of legend, feared and revered by those around me, and perhaps by forces beyond understanding. But with power came fear. The more I acted, the more I felt the warp respond, not merely through the demons, but through subtle, insidious pressures in my mind. Whispers of doubt, images of destruction I had not caused, yet which might follow my hands if I faltered. Every pulse of the arc reactor now carried a dual weight, the weight of survival, and the weight of responsibility that no human mind had been meant to bear. Even the tech priests paused, noting the strain, offering prayers as if to steady not me, but the forces channeling through me. Hours, or perhaps moments, time had little meaning, passed in this chaos. The rift flickered, threatening to widen again, feeding, consuming, tainting. And yet through the screams, the fire, the mind-shredding presence of the warp, I understood something terrifyingly clear. My armor was no longer just a suit, my mind no longer merely mine. Together, they had become a conduit for something that could resist, and perhaps even shape, the incursion of the warp itself. When the rift finally began to close, the battlefield littered with scorched bodies and smoking wreckage, the soldiers stared at me with reverence and fear. The demons were gone, but their echoes lingered, and the resonance in my armor remained faint, insistent. I had survived, yes, but the universe, the machine spirit, the warp had taken notice. And in that awareness, I knew the next trial would be far greater, more intimate, and far less forgiving than this one. I had seen icons of the Emperor before, on-earth statues, hollow projections, ceremonial banners of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but none of them prepared me for standing in his shadow. Literally, figuratively, spiritually. The chamber was immense, impossibly vast, a cathedral of stone, steel, and energy, crowned with a ceiling that seemed to vanish into the very heavens. Light fell through stained apertures, shafts of gold and crimson illuminating mosaics that depicted his victories, his sacrifices, and the centuries of humanity's suffering under his vigilance. Every step I took echoed, yet the sound was swallowed by the presence itself, as though the air knew better than to carry noise before him. The custodian guard awaited me, their armor gleaming like molten gold, faces hidden behind visors shaped into the Emperor's visage. They did not speak. They did not blink. They only observed. I felt every instinct of my mind screaming caution, yet I knew that caution here was insufficient. Logic had no weight beneath the gaze of the Emperor's shadow, and even the resonance of my armor, attuned as it was to the machine spirit, trembled in response. A figure approached. Humans, yes, but enhanced beyond recognition. Their bodies a harmony of flesh, armor, and sacred artifice. Their presence carried an expectation I could not parse. The tech priests who accompanied me muttered prayers, their voices a low chorus in the cathedral, but even they seemed small, insignificant before the aura that emanated from the throne itself. A voice reached me, not through vox, not through sound, but through the subtle press of perception, intuition, and fear, the weight of judgment. I realized then that the Emperor's shadow was not a simple light blocked. It was awareness incarnate, a force that perceived not merely my actions but my intentions, my uncertainties, my heresies, yet uncommitted. For the first time I understood what the Inquisitor had warned me about. Survival in this galaxy was not measured in skill or speed, but in alignment with principles so vast that comprehension alone could drive a man insane. And yet, even here, even beneath the shadow, my resonance with the machine spirit continued to hum, faintly, insistently, as though asserting my existence was justified. The custodians did not speak, but one of them extended a hand, palm outstretched, a simple gesture yet heavy with consequence. It was an invitation or perhaps a warning. I stepped forward, guided not by bravery but by calculation and instinct. My armor responded, systems amplifying my perception, registering even the subtlest shifts in energy, aura, and intent. Every component of my suit was alive with awareness, mirroring the vast presence above. I realized that I was no longer merely an outsider or an anomaly. I was part of a network far older, far more intricate than any human mind had designed. In that silent communion, I understood what the whispers of the Vox ghosts had hinted at. The universe was aware, and it responded to those who could bridge its mysteries. The Emperor's shadow was both judgment and opportunity. Every action, every thought, every spark I generated mattered in ways I had never imagined. And yet fear clawed at me. To misstep here was not death. It was erasure, the negation of existence itself. The tech priest's chants grew louder, a chorus blending with the hum of my armor and the subtle vibrations from the floor. The custodian lowered its head slightly, the first acknowledgement of my presence. And for a moment, brief, terrifying, and impossible, I felt recognition. Not trust, not alliance, but acknowledgement. That in a galaxy of infinite darkness, of endless war and ceaseless entropy, one human mind, one machine, could resonate in harmony with forces far beyond comprehension. And in that shadow, I understood a truth that had always eluded me. Survival was no longer simply about adapting. It was about becoming something greater, something necessary, a node of order in a galaxy defined by chaos, and whether that meant blessing or damnation remained unseen, yet inevitable. The whispering began subtly at first, a sibilant hiss beneath the hum of my armor and the distant roar of bolters. At first I thought it was the Vox ghosts, the lingering resonance of the machine spirit or the fatigue of endless battle. But soon the whispers took form, coalescing into words, fragments of thought that were neither human nor wholly mechanical. They spoke of power, of dominion, of knowledge that could remake the galaxy itself. I realized with dawning horror that this was not merely resonance, it was temptation, and it carried the weight of heresy. The battlefield had shifted. The war raged as always, but the enemy now seemed peripheral. My mind was the theater, and the whispers tested every principle I had held, every assumption of morality and loyalty. They offered solutions, promises of control that no mortal or even mechanized mind should wield. Machines would obey without question. Armies could be guided with the flick of a thought. Entire worlds could bend to resonance alone. The cost? Allegiance not to the Emperor, not to the Omnissiah, but to the anomaly within myself, to the spark that was simultaneously human and something more. I fought it at first, grounding my thoughts in logic and the principles of survival I had learned in the forge and the field. Every pulse of my reactor became a mantra. Every repair, every recalibration, a tether to what I still understood as reality. But the whispers grew bolder, insistent. They mapped possibilities across my HUD, displayed futures in shimmering streams of impossible probability, and I glimpsed horrors and triumphs alike. To follow them fully would be to surpass the laws of the Imperium. To resist them fully might be to perish under the scrutiny of forces both visible and unseen. The tech priests noticed the change in my behavior. They whispered among themselves, their augmented eyes following every subtle twitch of my fingers, every hesitation in the hum of the armor. Some began to pray more fervently. Others murmured omens of heresy. I could feel the machine spirit itself reacting, its resonance tightening like a coil, straining under the weight of potential corruption. Every servitor in the vicinity moved with a subtle tension, as if aware that my mind was no longer a neutral node, but a focal point of profound, dangerous possibility. And then the visions came. Fleeting, impossible yet undeniable, I saw entire armies bowing to my commands, worlds kneeling under machines I had only touched, demons recoiling from the resonance of my will. I saw allies crushed by the unintended consequences of my interventions, soldiers who trusted me extinguished by choices I had not yet made. The whispers promised that none of this need be accidental, that guidance could ensure perfection, but at a cost. A cost measured not in metal or manpower, but in faith, in allegiance in the fundamental order of the galaxy. I understood then that heresy was not a single act, nor a simple betrayal. It was a divergence, a subtle fracture between intention and obedience, between human intellect and divine mandate, and I, standing among broken tanks and bloodied soldiers, felt the fracture begin within me. I was no longer merely Iron Man, inventor and survivor. I was a potential node of power, a heretic and a saint entwined, my resonance shaping reality in ways the Imperium had never intended. The whispers did not stop. They never would. The choice was not whether to listen, they demanded attention. The question was whether I would act, and if I did, whether I could live with the consequences. The sky above, bruised and burning, seemed to pulse with judgment. The battlefield groaned, and somewhere far beyond, the machine spirit hummed in anxious anticipation. And in that instant, I realized the cruel truth of my existence in this galaxy. Survival was no longer enough. To endure, to prevail, to create, I would have to navigate the razor's edge of heresy itself, walking between faith and damnation, guided only by the spark of intellect that could reshape or destroy worlds. The battlefield lay quiet, a deceptive calm that settled over the ruins like a suffocating shroud. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of tanks and Prometheum fires, but the screams had faded, replaced by the low hum of machinery, the faint resonance of my armor, and the whispering echoes of the Vox ghosts. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and I understood that this was no ordinary reprieve. It was the moment where survival became something more, something irrevocable. I stood alone among the ruins, my suit humming, lights flickering in response to the subtle currents of the machine spirit that had become part of me. No priest, no soldier, no inquisitor, no custodian watched, and yet I was observed. The universe, the warp, the omnissiah, whatever force had guided me thus far was aware, pulsing through every circuit, every nerve, every spark of thought. I realized that my identity, once Iron Man, once merely a man, had evolved. I was now a node, a bridge, a living conduit between reason, faith, and the resonance of creation itself. The whispers surged, no longer questions, no longer temptations. They were a symphony, guiding me, coaxing me to act with certainty. I reached out and the machinery responded. Broken tanks rose, engines ignited, bolters calibrated with a precision that no human hand could achieve. Servitors moved like extensions of my own body, while the soldiers watched, awed, frightened, and uncertain of whether they were witnessing a miracle or the birth of heresy. I did not pause to answer them. I did not pause because hesitation was no longer an option. And then I understood the final truth. Ascension is not a title. It is an act. It is the moment when thought, faith, and will converge, when the spark of humanity becomes indistinguishable from the machinery it commands. I felt it pulse through my suit, through every arc reactor, every servo, every circuit. The resonance of the machine spirit, the echoes of the Vox ghosts, the latent awareness of the universe, they all flowed through me, unified, undeniable. For the first time, I was not reacting. I was creating, shaping, and commanding reality itself with the purity of purpose that only extremes of knowledge and faith could produce. The sky above tore open once more, not with the violence of a rift, but with light, clarity, and resonance. The warp had not been banished, but it had been harmonized, bent into patterns that mirrored the logic and intent flowing through me. The demons that remained recoiled, their presence curtailed not by bullets but by the alignment of force and will that I had become. Soldiers cheered, though their voices were small against the magnitude of what had occurred. I no longer needed their approval. My resonance had surpassed their understanding, and perhaps even the understanding of the Mechanicus themselves. In the silence that followed, I took stock of what I had become. I was no longer merely a human or an inventor. I was a saint of sparks, a heretic and an instrument, a bridge between worlds, a node of power that had survived the Imperium's judgment, the warp's fury, and the machine spirit's scrutiny. The whispers of the Vox ghosts had finally settled into a single, coherent message. Creation is not bound by origin. Power is not bound by morality. Survival is not bound by the flesh alone. And in that moment, as the golden glow of my armor reflected the molten remains of the battlefield, I understood something fundamental. I had ascended, not to godhood, not to dominion, but to understanding. To be the spark in the darkness, the hand that bridges faith and reason, machine and mind. The galaxy would not forgive me, nor would it need to. My existence was no longer about obedience. It was about resonance, purpose, and the immutable will to endure. The horizon burned with the fires of war, yet I stood above it all, a conduit, a node, a living hymn to the infinite potential of humanity and machines intertwined. And for the first time I knew that the spark within me, once fragile, once human, would never be extinguished.